All right, so thanks everybody for coming out. I'm JD, I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about building the right product tonight and talking about how to approach the discovery process. I welcome any questions as I go through this, but if you think of anything afterwards, you can always hit me up on Twitter. This is my Twitter handle here, and I've also got my email there. I'm going to start off with some very provocative statistics to get you guys a little excited. So 16% of IT projects are completed on time and on budget. Only 16%. It's a really low number. 41% of those IT projects don't deliver their expected business value. 31.1% of those projects are going to be canceled before completion. So you're probably asking, why? Why are so many projects failing? So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you a little bit about the company that I work at, Modus Create. Just so you know about my background, our background as a company, really where all of this information is coming from. So we're a product studio. What we do is we help other companies build, launch, and plan their product releases. And what we've done is over the last 3 or 4 years, we've really pioneered a process for doing this discovery process. And we call it we just interact with our clients for about 2 weeks, 1 week on site most of the time. And I'll be talking about that process in depth. So, the title of the talk is Building the Right Product. So in order to kind of understand that, we need to understand what do I mean when I say right. And so I have a little handy dandy acronym here, MAPS. It's real easy to remember. So the right product is meaningful, it's achievable, profitable, and sustainable. And I'll go through each one of those. So what do we mean when we say that a product is meaningful? This means that the product solves a problem, right? It's going to deliver and really meet the needs of your users. Achievable. What this means, and this really ties back, remember, to those criteria for why we consider a project a failure. Building the project on time, given your time constraints, given your budget constraints, and your resource constraints. Profitable. So this has to do with, your project needs to meet its business needs within the organization. And then sustainable. This means that you're able to build the project and keep maintaining it without, needing 20 coders with an IV drip of Red Bull in their arm every night just to stay awake. I think there's this kind of myth of the ninja coder who does that, who stays up all night just to get out that next release, working 60-hour weeks. And, that's not sustainable. Eventually, those guys are going to burn out. So we'll talk about how to combat that. So when you heard me say meaning profitable, you probably, if any of you have ever been to Lean Startup, how many people have been to Lean Startup or know about Lean Startup? Okay, so a few people. That probably brought to mind Lean Startup. The key thing to note, though, here is that Lean Startup, there's this core concept of the MVP. And a lot of people, I think, have a misconception that an MVP has to be working code. It has to be a product that you've actually built. But in reality, an MVP is really just anything that helps you learn about your product. And that can be in the form of, identifying risks, gauging interest in the product idea. So really, an MVP can be a survey. It can be a landing page that you launch just to see how many people are interested. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the minimal marketable product. And this is a little different from an MVP in that it is a working product. It is working software. You're identifying the minimum set of features that you need to make that product really solve a problem for people, meet their needs, and also meet your business needs. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is kind of how do we go from here over to here. Right now, there's kind of a chasm there. There's not a clear process for, how do I define what I need to build. So in order to kind of illustrate that a little bit, we're going to walk through an example, and I'll be using this example throughout the talk tonight. So I'm sure, we're all UX people here, and I'm sure a lot of you have done interviews before, usability studies. And, one thing that I've experienced as a usability tester and a UX designer is, I'm interviewing someone and there's a lot of really good salient data and I'm recording this interview. And afterwards, I think like, oh, there's that really good quote. And I go back and I try to find it. And then I have to sift through, like an hour-long recording to find out where that is. So that's the problem that we're working with here. So user experience researchers who record more than 15 interviews per month have a problem locating those important moments within the hours of recordings that they have. So what do we get out of the lean startup process? We're going to get out some information about the problem. So we may learn that it's not just UX researchers that have this problem. It could also be students, it could also be business analysts. And we also learn about the solution eventually after we've iterated on that problem statement. And so let's just say for the sake of this example, let's say we learn that the solution is going to be a tool where while I'm recording, I can basically just drop a timestamp on that recording and come back later and go right to it and figure out where that important critical moment was. And we might learn some other things as well. We're also going to figure out our risks and assumptions. And so let's imagine that you come out of the MVP process with all that information and you hand it over to your development team, your coders, and you say, okay, let's build it. They're going to be like, dude, I have no idea what to do because there's no requirements. They're going to be like, where are the requirements? All you gave me was what you learned so far. So that kind of brings us back to why do those IT projects fail? And so the Standish group, they did a study where they surveyed a bunch of product people on product teams and asked them, what are the most common reasons that your projects are failing? And these are really the most common reasons. So again, to tie it back to the requirements, we have incomplete, unclear, or changing requirements. Lack of user input, lack of resources, and then lack of executive support to actually get the buy-in from your executive team to achieve and to obtain those resources, the money, the people that you need to build it. And then this wasn't in the report, but it's something that we like to add. It's just something that we've seen by doing this process over and over again. Whenever there's a lack of shared understanding among your team and across your team, it's going to make that successful product really hard to achieve. So how do we fix it? So during this talk, I'm going to talk about how do we write clear and complete requirements? How are we going to use data to support our prioritization of those requirements? And then once we have those requirements prioritized, how are we going to estimate our budget and our schedule more accurately, given those resource and time constraints? And then the last thing, I'll talk about a couple of strategies we can follow to manage up to those executives, get executive buy-in for your product. So let's dive in. So we like to basically section off the discovery process into these different stages. And so this diagram doesn't really do it justice because it's not really a linear process like this. It's not like a waterfall thing. This is very iterative, and all of these different things are going to be informing each other at once. So what we do is we start with project goals, and I'll go into each one of these in detail in a second. This is just kind of a bird's eye view. Then we dive into user research, and out of that we develop personas. We develop the user workflows. And then from there, we start developing our requirements, user stories. And I'll talk about that in a second. It's a very agile term. We do competitor analysis, so we're looking at a lot of other other products in the space to see what they're doing. Complexity estimation. Again, this gets into estimating, how long is that project going to take for us to build. And then based on all of that information we've collected, we move into prioritizing and estimating the time and budget. So how many people here are familiar with the term user story? Okay, great, that's awesome. So this will probably be a little pedantic for you guys, but this is kind of the basic form that you should follow when you're writing a user story. You don't have to write them this way, but it's kind of a good practice to follow, especially if you're just starting out. Because if you're doing it this way, it really does bridge the gap between the developer who needs to know exactly what they need to build and the business people who need to know why is this feature being included in the product. So the basic format is, as a type of user or persona, I want to do something in the product so that I can achieve a goal. And I'll I'll talk a little bit later about some do's and don'ts when we're writing user stories. But in order to understand this process, we kind of have to start at the end and work backwards. So that's why I'm telling you about the user stories now. And kind of the end product, when you're done, you'll have a list of 100, 200 user stories, however many, and you'll need to prioritize those because the truth is, in reality, at the end of the day, not all of the requirements that you write are going to make it into that first release of your products or even the second release, third release. So that's why you need to prioritize. So when push comes to shove, you can figure out what gets in, what doesn't get in. And so the way that we typically like to approach that is we start off by bucketing all of the user stories into these 3 different groups. So we have must-haves, should-haves, and nice-to-haves. And the reason that this is a good way to start is because think about it, you might have like a list of 100 or 200 user stories. And as you're going through those, when you're on the first few, you're not going to know what else is in that list. So it makes it a little harder for you to get the entire sense of the entire list of requirements. I don't know how to prioritize this requirement when I haven't seen that one at the end. And then once you have put them in these buckets, that's when you can start moving into this requirement comes before this one comes before that one. So that's kind of the end goal, to get that list of requirements prioritized. So what goes into a priority? What's the data that we should be using to decide what that priority should be? So we're going to talk about project goals. That goes into the priority. User goals, user flows, user feedback. A lot of the things that I talked about earlier. So project goals. Why do we make goals? You need to know where you're going before you can get there. And by working with your team to develop these goals, first of all, you identify what success means for your project. In addition to just finishing on time and on budget, you also need to identify the goals that your product team is trying to achieve. At the same time, by doing this with your team, you're making sure everyone's moving towards a common goal. I mentioned earlier the lack of shared understanding. Doing this together really helps with that issue. And then demonstrating the value of your project. So imagine kind of pitching an idea to your boss and not really explaining to them like, how is this going to help the business? When you define your goals, you're able to say, okay, this is what we're going to achieve. This is how it will help the business as a whole. So business goals, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically business goals, what are those? They're strategic organizational goals, typically revenue targets, profit targets, acquisition, things like that, key performance indicators. What I really want to focus on, since we're UX designers here, product people, I want to focus on the product and UX goals. So we've been doing this process for a lot of years now, and typically when we ask someone what are your UX goals, they'll give us a lot of different responses. And this is just an idea of what we're talking about when we say UX goals: key features, UX improvements, bugs, target devices. So do we want this on tablet, mobile, and then any third-party integrations that we need. The one that sticks out a lot to me is UX improvements. As I was starting to say, when we ask these clients, what improvements do you need to make to the UX? Typically, we'll get responses like, well, I want to create an experience that is easy to use. So what do you guys think about this goal? Good goal, bad goal? Yeah. So when I see goals like this, I'm not too happy about it. And we see goals like, I want to streamline the user experience. And it's obvious that the client here is trying to say, like, I want to make it faster. But still, it's not specific enough. And then my personal favorite, I want you to make it pop. I want you to make it really sexy. And that just kind of outrages me. But there's a good reason that people they're giving us these responses when we ask them. It's because measuring the user experience is a very difficult thing to do. A lot of people don't know where to start. So when we talk about goals, a lot of you have probably heard of SMART goals, and they're applied to a lot of different things. They're applied to career development, business, whatever. And it's kind of different depending on what you're applying them to. In terms of UX, I've taken some creative liberties here, But so when we're talking about SMART, we're talking about the goal should be strategic, it should be measurable, it should be actionable, it should be realistic, and it should be time-based. So we'll go through each one of those. When we say strategic, the goal, like I said earlier, it needs to align to your organization's high-level business goals. So they have their goals at the top level. You as a product team, you exist within a larger organization, and your product, what you're achieving, needs to align to what they want, especially if you want that executive support. Measurable. So this means that you can objectively measure your progress towards achieving the goal. And so what does objective mean? That means that basically 2 different people, 10 different people, they can analyze the same data and they'll come to the same conclusions or very similar conclusions. Actionable. So this means you can follow a targeted strategy to get to those goals. Realistic, again, this brings it back to those criteria for why projects are failing. You can achieve the goal given your budget, time limitations. And then time-based. So this just means you should have a deadline for the goal. Otherwise, you could just say, we'll get there eventually in like 20 years, and then we'll say, yay, we did it. So what are some good goals, some good examples of some UX goals? So we can look at task success and error rates. When we talk about task success, we want to know, how often are people achieving and completing the tasks that they're doing in the app. And we might say, okay, we want them to achieve and be successful 80% of the time on all tasks. But you also have to take in consideration error rates. So I may complete a task, but at the same time, I may have a hell of a time doing it and run into like 30 errors, user errors. So at the same time, you should be counting, how many times did the user trip over themselves and create goals around that. So I want to achieve a 60% task success rate with only 0 errors. Adoption and retention. So here we're talking about acquiring new people, new users. This plays into like conversion rate, or I'm at the end of my billing cycle. Am I going to re-up and pay you again? Conversion rates there. When we talk about efficiency, this ties back to I really want to streamline the user process, the UX. And so here, we're really talking about time on task. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we define the tasks that we want to time in a moment. But this could be something like, I want to reduce the median time to do something by 500%. And you can see that all of these goals have a deadline. And then user engagement. That's another way that we can quantify the user experience. So a lot of times this is, how much time are people spending in the app? How often are they sharing things? How many pictures are they taking? Things like that. But at the same time, this is kind of a fuzzy thing that you need to discuss with your product team, because, take for example, a healthcare company. They might have a patient portal or a consumer portal where people can log in. And obviously, if people are logging into that all the time, that's not exactly what you want, because that means people are sick and they're making a lot of claims. So for a healthcare company, high engagement might mean more of supporting them in those high times of need when they're going to the ER, when they're going to their first doctor's visit to a specialist. So it's really up to your team to define what engagement means and finding out a way to track that. We also typically define some other types of goals. So we have team goals. Do you need to hire new people? Do you need to get training for your team in order to build out this product? Tech goals. Do you need to migrate off of that back-end system that's antiquated and move to something newer so your stuff works faster? And then non-goals. So this is probably one of the most important, in that you need to specifically identify what you're not trying to do with this product. So in the end, when you show the product to your boss and they say, well, where's the tablet version? You can point to this and you say, no, we said that was not a goal. So that's kind of a way to cover your ass moment. So you're probably asking yourself, where do I get these numbers from? I'm saying I want to increase my conversion rate by 35%. Do I just pull that number out of thin air? And the answer is that there's kind of a cascading effect, right? Again, tying it back to your organization's business goals. You can kind of see how these things are related. So if your organization wants to increase their revenue by 10% by the end of 2016, that means for your product, you may want to generate 100K, given that you know what portion of that 10% you should be accountable for. And then from there, you can know, okay, UX goal, I need to acquire 1,000 new users. I need to increase my conversion rate by this much. So there's kind of that nice cascading effect. And you might have to do some math, but it'll be worth it in the end. And then how do I decide which metrics to track? You might be kind of tempted to just say, I'm going to track everything. But you really need to kind of narrow it down and target, choose your few metrics that mean a lot to you. And so the first thing you need to consider is the level of effort it's going to take to track that metric. So some of these things like time on task, that's not something that you can monitor just by doing analytics. That's something that you're really going to have to do usability testing with a lot of people to get a statistically significant number. But then other things like conversion rate, you can probably implement that pretty quickly with like Google Analytics or something like that. The other thing is meaning. So you should be tracking the things that you expect to change based on the things you're changing within your product. So if I'm redoing the sign-in flow, or the sign-up flow, then I probably want to be tracking my conversion rate. And then strategic, I kind of already went over this, but again, tying your goals back to your overhead or your overarching business goals within your organization. And the added benefit of creating these goals with your team is that the entire team has to really commit to doing usability testing, doing analytics, because otherwise there's no way for them to track their progress towards meeting these goals. And I think that's a reason why a lot of teams don't do this stuff, is because it just gets kind of pushed to the wayside because they haven't actually talked about it from the beginning of the project. So how do we prioritize these goals? And this is a theme you'll see throughout the talk, prioritization. It's really a process of ruthless prioritization, figuring out what's most important. So a technique that we like to use a lot is, we call it scarcity voting. And so this kind of points to the fact that you should be prioritizing everything as a team. You shouldn't just be alone by yourself in a dark room somewhere saying, yes, this should come before this. So if you have let's say 4 people on your team, just for simplicity's sake, and you have 4 goals, what you can do is write each goal down on like a sticky note or an index card, and you give every person like a little colored sticker. And then each one of those stickers represents a vote for that goal. And then what they can do is, so we can see this guy over here, he voted 3 times for this goal, whereas he only voted once for here and none for that. So it really forces people to think about, what do I value most for this product? And it helps you kind of collaborate and figure out multiple different perspectives from different people, UX, business, developers. Okay, so now we'll dive into user needs, user flows, and feedback. Are there any questions before I move forward with that? Okay, great. So user needs, why do we figure out our users' needs? We need to figure out, what defines success for them. We need to figure out, are there certain pain points in their process? We need to figure out, are certain needs more important than others? Again, prioritization. We need to also use these user needs to figure out which user stories are most important. And this is really, kind of, again, the end product of this process, a list of user stories that are prioritized. So one thing that I'll say, I'm sure all of you have probably created personas before or know about personas, know a little bit about user research, how to develop them. But I think one thing that gets kind of forgotten sometimes is that not all personas are created equal. They're not all valued equally in regards to your business and your product. So as an example, for the app that I was talking about earlier, the recorder, we may have the VP of product, they might be the gateway to the money. They're the decision makers. So their business value is a little bit higher. But then when we think about, what percentage of our user base is the VP of product? They're not going to make up a large percentage of that user base. They might be in there every now and then to handle like billing issues, things like that. And then we look at the user UX researcher. So they're going to be, the people who are in there the most. They're really the demographic that we're targeting for this product. And they're also, there's professionals who work as freelancers. They, have enough money to pay for, maybe like a professional plan versus an enterprise plan. And then we may look at like a student who's, we could get a lot, like a fair number of students, we think. But in terms of money, they don't have a lot of money. They're still in school. So maybe we start like a free ads-based version, something like that. Okay, so next we'll talk about user workflows. And this is kind of similar to a user journey, if you've ever heard of it, heard of those. But basically, this is a way to really delve into the process that people are following using your app and outside of the app to figure out, what are the requirements that we need to build. So you're answering questions here like, where are the pain points in the process? And those pain points directly translate into opportunities for user stories. You also want to know, like I said, user stories. What should the product enable its users to do? And then, again, we're really thinking about how do we prioritize these user stories. And so if we're mapping user stories to tasks within a workflow, we need to know, how frequent is that task? How important is that task? A task may be frequent. You may do it all the time. There may be other tasks like signing in or, paying a credit card bill that you don't do that often, but they're incredibly important to your business needs, being successful in your business needs, as well as your users being successful. So as I said before, opportunities and the steps and tasks, this is really kind of the beef of where you're identifying those user stories. There's kind of a one-to-one mapping there. And so how are we collecting that data? How are we figuring out what people are doing? And there's a lot of different methods that we can follow to do this. You guys have probably heard of a lot of these before. So we have contextual inquiry. Contextual inquiry is a little bit like an interview, but at the same time, it's completely different. The point of contextual inquiry is that you're doing the interview and you're observing your users in context of where they're using the app, where they're completing these tasks. So typically, you would go visit where they're working and sit down with them. And it's different from an interview in that you kind of turn control over to them and ask them to walk you through their process. And that's really where it differs from an interview. An interview, in contrast, to develop a user workflow, it's not necessarily the best way to do it, but you also have to consider the amount of additional overhead that doing something like contextual inquiry or observation adds. It's not the quickest way to get things done. So there's kind of a trade-off here. How accurate do you want the data and how much time do you want to spend doing it? So there's a couple of strategies you can follow to make that data that you pull out of an interview a little more accurate. And a couple of things you can do to help users and the people you're interviewing really accurately relay that process that they follow without actually being in the moment and doing that process. So one thing that I've found really helpful is as you're interviewing the person, start to map out visually. And if you're doing this over, GoToMeeting, you should share your screen and use like a tool like Lucid Charts, something like that, to map out step by step what they're saying, pairing it back to them so that they can see what those steps are. And this does two things. First, oh, there it goes. Try to unplug it and plug it back in.
Thank God. They're angry. Yeah.
All right, we're good. Well, bear with me. Okay, so as I was saying, as you're going through the interview, mapping out the process, letting them see it visually. And so the two things that this accomplishes is if there's any points of confusion, you can immediately point to that chain of events and say, well, where does this happen? So like when you're interviewing, the person might say, well, first I greet the participant, then I explain the interview, and then I just start asking them questions. And you might need to get to a more granular level of detail. So you might ask them like, well, when do you start recording? And you can point to that process and say like, is it around here? And just by them seeing it, they're going to be able to really know what level of granularity you're expecting from them. Because if I ask one person, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? One guy's going to be like, well, I put the peanut butter on the bread and the jelly on the bread and I make a sandwich. And someone else might say, well, I go to the store, I park my car, I open the door, I walk into the store, I buy the bread. Like, there's all these different steps, and it's really up to you, like how granular you need to be given your research goals. So competitor analysis. Why do we analyze competitor apps? We need to know what else is going on in the space. We need to identify our app's strengths and weaknesses in comparison to what other apps are doing. It also helps us, find inspiration for our UX design and our feature sets. If another app comes out with a new feature set and it actually maps really well to one of the user goals that you've identified, that's probably something you need to include in your app. And again, this helps us with prioritizing those user stories, as I said. So let's dive into user stories, kind of the bread and butter of this process. So take a second, read over this user story. So as a user, I want to search for a recording by keyword or filter by type so that I can find a recording. So what do you guys think? Is this a good story or a bad story? Bad story. So the reason this is bad is that, one, we're not being specific about who this story is for. We're just saying as a user. A user can be anyone. This is, again, you need to tie this back to those personas you've created. This is really more than one user story. We're saying I want to search for a recording by keyword or filter by type. That needs to be broken down into two separate stories. And basically almost any time that you see the word or and in a user story, that's like a red flag that you need to break it down into more specific user stories. And then at the end, I think I lost a word here, but this is kind of one of the hardest parts of writing user stories, is getting that really succinct goal that you're helping the user complete at the end. So if we go back, we see that I said, I can find a recording. You're basically just repeating what you already said. What you need to do here is really tie it back to the user goals and the business goals. And I had a lot of trouble with that, actually, when I first started writing stories. So I read a lot about writing stories when I first started out, and I came across a lot of stuff written by a guy named Roman Pickler. And he has this concept of a ready story. So a ready story is a story that a developer can look at it and estimate its complexity. What's the level of effort needed to build this story? Developer can also figure out exactly what they need to build because that user story has written acceptance criteria. And you can actually go through after it's built and test it against those criteria to make sure it's doing those things it needs to do. And that kind of follows that the developer can implement the story. They understand what it needs to do. And a good story, a ready story, should specify what, not how. As UX designers, if we're not writing the requirements and someone else is, it's kind of a put-off when you see a user story and it's dictating what the UI is supposed to do. So when you're writing a user story, you shouldn't say, as a user, I want to use a drop-down to do this. It really just needs to say what needs to happen, not how it needs to happen. And so when you're writing these user stories, it's a good idea to kind of start out at the epic level. So an epic is really just a user story it's too big and too complex for a developer to be able to estimate it or really know what they need to build. So as an example, working with this recorder device and app that we've been talking about, you might say for an epic, as a UX researcher, I want to browse previous recordings. And by starting out with epics, it really helps you kind of map out a holistic view of the user experience and the product before you start to get into these nitty-gritty details of like, I want to sort by number of timestamps. I want to view them in list mode. I want to view them in grid mode. So we can see how these kind of break down into more specific things. And the really, really important thing that I can't stress enough is that you should be writing your user stories as a team together. There's nothing greater than having that immediate feedback. If I write that bad user story, I can have a developer there who can look at it and say, well, I don't really know what you want me to build. Or you might have a business person in the room and they may say, well, I don't understand why we're including this feature in the app. You're not really telling me the business value. So then I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on estimating development complexity because I'm not a developer. But the way that we approach it at Modus is we have a couple of different scales that our developers size complexity on. when I say complexity, I mean, like level of effort, estimated level of effort to build this single requirement. So technically, or sometimes we'll use, like t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large. Those are kind of good when your user stories aren't at that very detailed level yet. 1, 2, 3, again, good for when you don't have very detailed stories. And then something that we've kind of moved into doing more lately is using the Fibonacci sequence. So this really, it's a little bit more accurate in that, you don't just have these different levels of specificity. You can say, well, this is a huge user story. It's a 21 versus it's kind of big, Okay, so prioritizing. We've got all this data now, right? For every single user story. We've gone through, we've identified, for this user story, what are the user goals? So for an example, let's take the user story. As a UX researcher, I want to timestamp when an important moment happens within a recording. So some user goals that supports. As a user, I want to spend less time analyzing recorded data. We can also look at business goals. So, I want to generate 100K in interest by the end of 2016. You can also have specific feedback from your users. So we've got this really beefy UX researcher here who is really pissed off that he couldn't find that perfect quote that he remembered, and it took him like an hour to find it. These are the things that are really salient and will help you get that buy-in from your executive team, especially when you show them like instances of emotion like this. So we're also mapping these user stories to tasks that our users are completing in the app. So we map them to the important tasks, the frequent tasks, to really build up that case that we need this feature because it's something people need to do. We're also looking at competitor features. So if we have another app that allows people to create timestamps, but maybe the UX isn't good, it's hidden in the UI. It's not a very, I guess, emphasized feature. Maybe you rate that a little bit lower. And so that can affect your prioritization as well. And then when we look at the development complexity, let's just say that this user story, we size it as a 2. So how do we go about actually prioritizing these user stories based on that data? What you should do is you should go through this multiple times. You shouldn't just go through, use your gut feeling, and prioritize things once and say, okay, I'm done. You need to go through multiple times because, as I said before, when you start with that first 10 user stories, you don't necessarily know what the rest of the 90 or so user stories is going to be. So it's hard to know, what do I prioritize this story as when I haven't seen the rest of the stories? And another thing that's important is prioritizing individually first, and then bringing it together as a group. It's a similar concept as brainstorming. There's a lot of studies out there that show if you're brainstorming as a group, it's best to start brainstorming individually so you don't have other people kind of steering where your mind is going. And you don't have one person who can kind of take over the conversation. So now I'll talk a little bit about budget and time estimates. So we have this list of user stories, right? They're prioritized into must-haves, should-haves, nice-to-haves. They could even be prioritized, in a very granular order. So when we're talking about estimating budget and time and scope, these are really the 3 key points of like the software, blanking on the word, iron triangle, I think is the term. Basically, we have scope, we have resources, and we have schedule. Scope refers to, again, your requirements, your user stories. Resources is your cost and budget and your team. And schedule is, how much time do you have? And so an old adage is that really one of these should be fixed, one of them should be firm, and one should be flexible. So you shouldn't be, just like pulling strings on each one of these different factors to get to, that time that you need and the budget that you need. And so before I jump into kind of a demo that I'm going to show you of a product that we built out of MotorCreate, I just want to say that this is really important. The discovery process never ends. So you're probably saying, well, like, why not? And one thing that I mentioned earlier, remember that one of the key reasons why projects fail is because of changing requirements. And to me, that's a little bit concerning that that's kind of the prevailing consensus, because your requirements are going to change. It's just going to happen. There's a reason that we call software software. It's infinitely malleable. You can basically change anything that you want. And the market is constantly going to be changing. There's going to be new competitors entering the market. There'll be existing competitors coming out with new features. There's going to be new technologies that are developed that can make your product faster that you may need to migrate your backend to or whatever. And not being able to adapt and change your requirements to incorporate those things, it's going to lead you getting left behind in the dust by your competitors. So this is why you constantly need to be prioritizing your backlog, and it just places an emphasis on why you need to use data to back up your decisions. So if I do need to build that new feature, where does it exist in this spectrum of priority based on the data we've collected about it, the user goals, the business needs? Okay, so now I'm going to hop out of here for a second to show you a product that we've built. It's called Product Shop. We've been doing the discovery process for a few years. We've really got that down to a T, we feel. And out of that discovery process, it was so successful that we decided to spin off a product that will help you scope and plan software. And it's called Product Shop. So I'll hop into that real fast. And I'm kind of just going to show you like the end product here. So we talked earlier, you have this list of user stories, right? And they're all prioritized. So how do I get to a point where I can start to estimate how much this product's going to cost to build, how long it's going to take? My boss is asking me, okay, you've collected all the requirements. What's it going to cost? How long is it going to take? Who do we need on the team to build it? And so this is a tree map. How many of you have seen a tree map before? Okay, so the way that this works is basically the size of the box. We have things broken down by theme. So we have user stories in like health and wellness, benefits and coverage. So this is it's a healthcare app. And the size of the box represents the development complexity of all of the stories in that theme. So we can see here like claims and balances, that's kind of making up a large portion of what we're building for this product. And so this is really where that prioritization comes in. If I've decided that my scope is going to be flexible, what I can do is I can come over here and start to say, well, what would happen if I didn't build the must-haves in the provider theme? Give it a second. Demos. Always works up until demo time. What's that?
It's a shipping product.
Sorry?
Have you sold this to anybody yet?
We're working on it. Yeah. Yeah, so let's see. If I unclick this, there we go. See that nice little animation? So we can see how the estimated cost changed. We can see how the timeline changed. So we're doing 42 sprints instead of however many it was before. And I can view this data in multiple different ways. I can view it by priority. So here we see that a lot of our stories are should-haves and nice-to-haves as opposed to must-haves, which is typically a good thing. You don't want to get to the end of the process and find out that every single user story we wrote is a must-have, because that kind of defeats the purpose of prioritizing. All right. So I'm going to hop back into my prezo real fast.
The video.
Oh, did it?
Okay.
It kind of hopped out and hopped back in for a second. All right.
We're going to replace this bad boy. Sorry about that.
No worries. Worked better than the demo.
Not helping those. Let's see. There we go.
I'm learning to love that little hourglass icon. So I just have some screenshots just in case the demo didn't work. Yeah, so that basically wraps up, what I'm here to talk about today. If you are interested in Product Shop, feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. I can show you a little bit of it. You can also go to productshop.io to request a demo. And another important announcement, we're hiring UX designers at Modus Create, and we're like, I really need help. I have way too much work to do. So if you're interested, go to moduscreate.com, hit us up. We're looking for multi-talented people, visual design, UX design. And yeah, thank you. Are there any questions? Sure. Enterprise, as opposed to scaling. Yeah, so the way that we view it is basically within the enterprise, you still have product teams, right? And this is really a tool for the product team. And the idea is that we would be able to sell this, or an enterprise would be able to use this and just disseminate it to their individual product teams. And at that point, it becomes kind of, again, mapping that product team's goals back to the enterprise level goals of, we want to increase revenue by this much. How is your product going to help us do that? And that's really where that the idea of managing up to your executives comes into play. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, that speaks to your resources though, right? And so there's trade-offs there. If you need to be flexible with your resources, and maybe you have a guy who's on 3 different projects, so you can't have 100% of his time. You need to take that into account when you're prioritizing your user stories, estimating how long it's going to take. You don't want to make promises you can't keep, So again, like if I know that this person is spread thin between 3 different projects, they're not just on one team. That's using that kind of that view that I showed, you would be able to see, okay, well, if our velocity is only 20 points per week as opposed to 30 because we don't have a fully dedicated UX designer or fully dedicated product manager, developer, whatever, then that's going to show you, okay, well, that's going to push the deadline out by however many weeks. Sure.
When you're taking up some of the groups like must-haves,
Mm-hmm.
what if the user stories are actually tendencies to the user stories from different groups?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so he's asking about, when we're taking priority into consideration, we have the must-have, should-haves, nice-to-haves, and what if there's dependencies among the user stories? So I may have one user story that's a must-have and another that's a nice-to-have, and maybe user story A needs to be built before user story B can be built. And if user story A is just a nice-to-have, but user story B is a must-have, then that kind of bumps that priority up of that nice-to-have.
Well, probably it's a little bit wrong. You have a provider, client, whatever, I don't really remember, and then division you have, and all of the sections